Ed Miliband has accused David Cameron and other world leaders of failing to stand by Libya, contributing in part to the crisis in the Mediterranean. The Labour leader said the UK had repeated the same mistakes in post-conflict planning for Libya as were made in Iraq, and the current refugee situation should have been anticipated. Conservatives denounced the remarks. Mr Cameron called them ill-judged. But Mr Miliband rejected claims he had politicised the issue as nonsense. Setting out his foreign policy priorities in a speech in London, Mr Miliband also pledged to rebuild the UK's international standing, claiming Mr Cameron had presided over the biggest loss of influence in a generation and placed the UK's future in the European Union in doubt. The BBC's assistant political editor Norman Smith said Labour were making clear that they were not blaming the Prime Minister for the recent deaths in the Mediterranean. But Lib Dem leader Nick Clegg said any suggestion of political point scoring on the back of a total human tragedy was pretty distasteful. Avoidable. Mr Miliband voted in favour of UN-authorised airstrikes against former Libyan leader Muammar al-Gaddafi in 2011, designed to stop the slaughter of Libyan civilians in Benghazi. The intervention led to the collapse of the Gaddafi regime, but the country has descended into chaos since then. An estimated 800 people died when their boats sank off the Libyan coast on Sunday, while more than 35,000 people are thought to have crossed from Africa to Europe this year, many of them being transited through Libya and departing from there. In a speech in London, the Labour leader suggested that the UK and the wider international community had let Libya down. David Cameron was wrong to assume that Libya was a country whose institutions could be left to evolve and transform on their own, he said. The tragedy is that this could have been anticipated. It should have been avoided. And Britain could have played its part in ensuring the international community stood by the people of Libya in practice rather than standing behind the unfounded hopes of potential progress only in principle. A briefing note released by Labour ahead of the speech sparked a row after it suggested Mr Miliband would say the refugee crisis and tragic scenes in the Mediterranean this week were in part a direct result of the failure of post-conflict planning for Libya. Asked after his speech whether he was directly pinning the blame on Mr Cameron, Mr Miliband said the Conservatives were trying to whip up a storm and his position was absolutely clear. As far as what is happening with the tragic scenes of people drowning in the Mediterranean, that is the result of the people traffickers. But nobody can disagree with the idea that the failure of post-conflict planning has been responsible for some of the situation we see in Libya and indeed people then fleeing. Direct blame. He was later asked during a BBC Radio 1 Newsbeat event why he had not asked about Libya during Prime Minister's questions for 4 years. Mr Miliband said he had raised the issue in the Commons in February. Speaking on a campaign visit to Lincoln, Mr Cameron said leaders needed to demonstrate clarity, consistency, and strength in the face of a dangerous and uncertain world. On Thursday, Mr Cameron pledged UK military assets to boost search and rescue efforts in the Mediterranean after an emergency EU summit, in which leaders agreed to treble funding for search and rescue efforts. The EU will also look at ways to capture and destroy smugglers' boats and deploy immigration officers to non-EU countries, officials said. The boost in funding to some €120 million, £86 million, brings spending back up to about the level of Mare Nostrum, an Italian-run search and rescue operation that was cancelled last year. Speaking on BBC Radio 5 Live, Mr Clegg said a considerable amount of thought had gone into how to stabilise Libya after Gaddafi's fall, contrasting this with the aftermath of the 2003 Iraq invasion, for which he said there had been no planning at all. But he added, at the end of the day the future of Libya is in the hands of the Libyan people. No lecture. Setting out his foreign policy vision, Mr Miliband said he would take a hard-headed approach to foreign intervention, saying it should only happen as a last resort and with the support of regional allies. Saying something needs to be done is not a sufficient guide to foreign policy, he said. However, he did not rule out extending sanctions on Russia for its actions in Ukraine, saying the EU had been too slow to act. Former Foreign Secretary William Hague said Mr Miliband cannot come to foreign policy with some ill-judged and opportunistic remarks after 5 years of saying very little at all. The Conservatives say they will ensure Britain is a major player on the world stage, exerting diplomatic influence through its bilateral alliances and its membership of the UN Security Council and the G7. In other election news, Mr Cameron says proposals for English votes for English laws would be in place for the first budget of a Conservative government. The Liberal Democrats say either an ideologically driven single-party government or an unstable alliance would put the economy at risk. HSBC says it is considering whether to move its global headquarters out of London. Northern Ireland's Health Minister Jim Wells has apologised for remarks he made during a gay marriage discussion. SNP leader Nicola Sturgeon said her party would prop up a minority Labour government even if the Conservatives had a 40-seat lead.